I'm David Ringstrom, a CPA in Atlanta, and welcome to our presentation on PivotTable basics. Over the course of our time together today, my goal is to demystify pivot tables for you. I sometimes feel like pivot tables almost bully people in Excel. I always chuckle when I will talk to somebody about Excel and they'll like say, I'm pretty good at Excel, but I don't do pivot tables. As if pivot tables are a third rail to be avoided or something. And that's ridiculously far from the truth. Pivot tables are actually one of the easiest features to use in Excel. Of course, they have some quirks and nuances that we'll be exploring along the way. But it's one of those rare opportunities where you can turn the tide and get Excel to do the work for you. In short, pivot tables are a report writing feature where you can take a list of data in your spreadsheet and then transform it into reports simply by dragging and dropping. So you can certainly get into writing formulas and doing elaborate things with pivot tables, but for today, we're going to be keeping it simple by mostly dragging, dropping. We'll see how to filter data, interact with our pivot tables, and create instant reports. Before I give you the overview of topics, I just want to share a bit of background about me. I have worked as a spreadsheet consultant for more than 30 years. I've taught over 2,500 webinars at this point, written a number of books, including Excel for Dummies and QuickBooks Online for Dummies. And so suffice it to say, pretty much all day, every day over my career, I've been doing things in Excel and helping others with Excel or teaching Excel or writing about Excel. So I do have decades of hard-fought knowledge that I've distilled down into this presentation and that I think will help you really be able to hit the ground running going forward with pivot tables. Or if you're already somewhat familiar, be able to really take where you are now and fill in a lot of those gaps and establish a much better comfort level. So our first section is going to lay the groundwork. We'll see where to get started with pivot tables, talk about the user interface, because that can be a little tricky itself. There's some hide and seek that Excel plays when it comes to pivot tables, where the ribbon tabs and field list can appear or disappear, sometimes unexpectedly if you're not sure what to expect. From there, we'll see how to structure our pivot tables by adding and removing fields, doing formatting, such as changing labels and so on. We'll see how to filter pivot tables a number of different ways, including one of my favorites, which is the slicer feature, which allows me to drill down into a pivot table with just a mouse click, just see less information on the screen. As you're going to find, pivot tables, particularly when we start filtering them, are highly useful for managing information overload. You can drill down and collapse a report down to just the data that's relevant at the moment, rather than having to feel like you're drowning in a sea of data. We'll then move on to maintaining our pivot tables, because the one big caveat about pivot tables that can be a little unnerving until you get used to it is that pivot tables do not work like formulas in Excel. They instead are a snapshot in time of your data that must be refreshed if you have made any changes to that data. Now, the other issue that I'll show you how to manage is if you've appended any data to the bottom of your source data list, the pivot table cannot see it unless you either manually resize the pivot table or, as we'll see, turn your data into an Excel table. So we'll blunder our way into some data integrity issues that plague a lot of folks, and then I'll give you a future-proofing solution. We'll wrap up by seeing how to really let Excel do the work for you by taking a look at the recommended pivot tables feature and the analyze data feature, that both are AI-based features that you can point it at a list and let it make suggestions for you. I'm going to be presenting from the Microsoft 365 for Windows version of Excel. That is the newest version of Excel and always will be. Granted, there's the counterpart on the Mac. I'm making the Windows distinction though because not everything on the Mac lays out in the same way as it does in Excel for Windows, and sometimes there is a functionality gap. Excel for Windows is definitely the favorite child in Microsoft's camp, and so There's more features in Excel for Windows and a little bit less in Excel for Mac. I term that the functionality gap. So if you find yourself looking for something in Excel for Mac that you can't carry out in Excel for Windows, just drop me a note, ask@davidinstructor.com. I'll be happy to clarify if you have fallen into the functionality gap and maybe can't do what you're trying to do, or hopefully it's just a matter of looking someplace else because the difference is in the operating system itself. This slide serves a dual purpose. It both shows you what to expect from how my slides are laid out, numbered steps that are very detailed. I'll be walking you through the PowerPoint slides first and then go to Excel and demonstrate the techniques firsthand. So you'll see everything at least twice today. But if you're not clear what version of Excel for Windows you're using, you can go to the File menu. Step 2, go to Account. Step 3, the Account screen will either say Microsoft 365 or it may have a different Excel version. If there is a year number in your Excel version, then you have a static version of Excel that will not see any updates in the future. If you're using Excel 2021 or later, you will be able to use everything I share with you today. If you have an older version of Excel, then the Analyze Data feature at the end, it will not be available to you. Conversely, Microsoft 365 is a dynamic version of Excel where Microsoft pushes out new updates on an ongoing basis, honestly, at an unimaginable pace. For years and years, there was a 3-year wait between seeing any new features in Excel. And so it's nice to not have to wait so long between getting new functionality in Excel. The handouts for today do include a PDF of today's presentation, as well as an example workbook that has most examples that I'll be teaching from. If you don't have the handouts, again, just drop me a note, ask@davidinstructor.com. Be happy to share that with you. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of creating a pivot table. We're going to see what the ideal data for a pivot table looks like. We'll then see how to create a pivot table from a data range. And I say that to distinguish it from creating it from an Excel table, which is our featuring technique that we're going to talk about at the end. Most folks are creating a pivot table from a data range, and that can set them up for some potential data integrity issues. But we want to make sure you have a good running start. So we'll just start from the very basic, and then we'll circle back to the future proofing toward the end of the presentation. We'll spend a little bit of time exploring the pivot table interfaces so that you know what to expect when you create a pivot table and how features can appear and disappear. And then we'll plot out a basic pivot table. The ideal data for an Excel pivot table is going to be a contiguous list of cells. Every column needs to have a unique header that's in a single row. And you also want to reword the headers if needed to better describe the data, because you will be using those headers to build your report. So if there's any vagueness, if there's two fields maybe that have very similar names but contain different data, you want to make sure that you reword those titles there so that you aren't making the wrong selection when you build your report. This rule about needing a single row of unique titles is actually what I consider an unwritten rule in Excel, where pivot tables mandate that you have a single row of titles like this. Other features don't mandate it, but across the board, Excel functions better as a whole if whenever you have a list of data, that you make sure that data has a single row of unique titles across the top. Many folks get hijacked unexpectedly because they might take titles and wrap them across two or three rows of cells, and that